Greetings, folks, and welcome to the second part of my little introduction to the Bhagavad Gita. And of course, I guess I need to use that word little in quotation marks. Last time out, we discussed the cultural background to some extent of the text and its worldview, some of the mythology involved, and some of the philosophic principles that are essential to the text. This time out, and over considerably less time, I'd like to try to situate the Bhagavad Gita itself in the larger body of narrative to which it belongs. That may sound like a modest demand until we consider what the body of narrative is to which it belongs. And to show you what I mean, let's just jump in. The Gita itself is a fragment of a very long Sanskrit epic called the Mahabharata, which itself was composed over roughly 1,000 years between 500 BCE and 500 CE. The Mahabharata tells the story of the Bharata family. Maha simply means great. It is etymologically related to both Germanic and Latinate words for great, such as major, Magnus, and many others. So it can be translated into English, I suppose, as the great tale of the Bharatas. It wasn't composed in a linear fashion. That is, there are older and more recent layers, so it grew kind of by accretion over the course, as I said, of roughly a millennium. It refers to both Vedic and Puranic gods. Its theology is Vaishnavite, as I mentioned in the previous talk. So when we jump into the Gita itself, we're jumping into one of the most important texts in Vaishnavite Hinduism specifically, although the text itself isn't limited to that particular niche. In fact, it is one of the three most widely translated books in the world, the other two being the Bible, which we've dipped our toes into a little bit, and the Tao Te Ching, which unfortunately I just don't have time to jump into with you folks this term. We are literally 1 week short, 1 week shy of being able to do that. As a bit of a side note on that theme, I've recently come to actually articulate it to myself and sometimes to my students that every syllabus they ever get from every professor with whom they ever study is in some sense an admission of defeat. There's always so much that we want to include on our courses that any syllabus that we actually do give is always the product of a series of very painful cuts. Or if you prefer, a fragment of a wish list left largely unfulfilled. But not to sound all maudlin on y'all, let's get back on topic. The Mahabharata itself is an epic. That is, it's in the same genre of poems such as the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid, the Tanbahulinga, and many, many others. Beowulf even is a distant cousin of the Mahabharata in a sense, as are all the great Norse family sagas. But the Mahabharata is the biggest of them all. This is not, to the best of my knowledge, the longest single work of literature in the world, but it is, to my knowledge, to my certain knowledge, the longest epic in the world, clocking in at 3 times the length of the entire Bible, or 7 times the length of the Iliad and the Odyssey combined, roughly. It is, within Hinduism, generally understood to be a work of literature, a deeply philosophically and theologically significant work of literature, but a work of literature. That is, it is not taken to be a literal history. There are some exceptions, but that is the case far more often than not. Though many of the characters in the epic are often taken to be historical personages. It positions itself within its own rhetoric as being a 5th Veda. That is, it certainly draws on all of the Vedas and on many of the Upanishads and Puranas for its ideological or religious or philosophic content. But Hindu theologians don't count it as a 5th Veda, so it doesn't have the same authority as a whole text as the Vedas, for instance, do. Now, the Bhagavad Gita is in a different situation. The Bhagavad Gita is a text within a text and speaks with its own authority. But to return to the Mahabharata as a whole, on which I'll be spending the majority of this talk, in addition to giving an absolutely fascinating account of creation, which I just don't have time to jump into, and by creation I mean the creation of this instantiation of the cosmos, it also includes, or really tells over its whole arc, the story of what we might call the world's biggest family feud, specifically a fracture which I will discuss later within the Bharata family itself, and the consequences of that break within otherwise very strong family bonds, or what should be family bonds. But to work into that question, we should probably talk about the text itself and how the text presents itself. And to give you fair warning, to a Western audience or readership, much of what follows is going to seem, or will probably seem, a little odd, or at least a little surprising. But I think, quite frankly, no more odd or no more surprising than many of the elements of many of the texts that we've already looked at. It's just that because these are more familiar to us from our own cultural perspective, for the most part, for most people in my classes, much of the weirdness or strangeness of them is sometimes masked by familiarity, and absent that familiarity, there is also often, I think, a deep strangeness in many of the myths that inform Western culture as well. All of which is to say, maybe, that we are strange beings, and we tell strange stories to explain ourselves, and we tell them in a wide range of metaphors and flavors. Now, as for the Mahabharata itself, this is where some of the weirdness begins. Its putative author, that is, the person to whom the composition is traditionally credited, is a person by the name of Krishna Dvaipayana Vyasa. The translation I have on my bookshelf has Vyasa listed as the author. But of course, authorial names on ancient texts are, quite frankly, dubious at best. As we discussed recently, for example, none of the Gospels that bear the names of apostles were actually written by those guys. The names were actually appended to the text sometime after they were composed. And as for Homer among the Greeks, there is no consensus on who Homer was or whether Homer actually existed. That is, whether there was a guy named Homer who imagined, composed, and wrote down the texts more or less as we have them. Most contemporary scholarship would argue that the authorship is not nearly that straightforward, and the composition is not nearly that simple. This is very much the case here, with the very notable exception that Krishna Dvaipayana Vyasa is also a character in the text, whereas Homer is not. Now, the Mahabharata also credits Vyasa with being the author of the Vedas, though the Vedas themselves make no mention of him to the best of my recollection. I could be wrong. He is also, though, for our purposes, an ancestor of all of the main characters, including of Arjuna, who is one of the two principal interlocutors of the Bhagavad Gita. The text as a whole, which is composed in poetry, is represented as being an oral composition, that is, a spoken text, whose original recipient is a person by the name of Vaisampayana. Within the text, Vaisampayana is presented as being the reciter of the poem. That is, the putative history of the text as presented in the epic is that it was composed and initially recited by Krishna Dvaipayana Vyasa to Vaisampayana, and Vaisampayana is the speaker of the text that we have. The person to whom Vaisampayana is speaking is one Janamejaya. So that is, the Mahabharata presents itself as being a text spoken by one specific person to another specific person. The person receiving the text, that is Janamejaya, is understood to be a descendant of Arjuna, who is the hero of the epic, or the principal hero of the epic. That is, for Janamejaya, this is a family history, and Janamejaya may well have been historical. And as for timelines, with Vyasa being an ancestor of Arjuna and Janamejaya being a descendant, don't worry too much about that. We're not stuck in here with average, normal human lifespans necessarily. I mean, if you have no trouble with a 600-year-old guy named Noah building a boat in a week that's big enough to save all of the land-dwelling animals on the planet, then you really should have no trouble with this. At least as a mythic or literary motif in either case. Now, to stick with Arjuna's family, although not all of these characters actually come up in the Gita, they do inform the historical or narrative situation in which he and Krishna are speaking. Arjuna's grandfather is a person by the name of Victor Travirya. He is the king. He is a member of the Bharata family, that is, he is a descendant of Bharata. Two of Victor-Traviria's sons are Dhritarashtra and Pandu. The sons of Dhritarashtra and Pandu are the principal antagonists in the epic. That is, the two sides, the Kauravas and the Pandavas, are first cousins. This is what I mean by saying this is a family feud. This is the family. And as for the thing they are fighting over, as I imagine some of you may have actually guessed, given that Victor-Traviria was the king, is who gets to be king, or more importantly, who ought to be king. Because this is very much an epic about things that ought to happen, happening. Now, as we move through the members of this family and some of their associates, one person I want to mention briefly, as he is actually mentioned briefly in the Gita itself, is a guy by the name of Bhishma. Bhishma is the brother of Victor-Traviria, therefore the grand uncle of the principal antagonists. Because of his exceptional piety, he's been granted the gift by the gods of not being able to die without his own consent. Now, this doesn't mean he can't be mortally wounded, but until he decides to die, he will simply continue breathing. He is a teacher and in many ways a moral paragon, and in the conflict in the Kurukshetra war, which is the war in which the Gita is set, he ends up in the Kaurava camp. That is, the camp that is ranged against the Pandavas, who include, of course, Arjuna. One thing about which the epic is actually really clear is that it's not a black and white dichotomy between good guys and bad guys, although there is definitely a moral argument to be made, particularly on the grounds of dharma, for the Pandava side being the correct side. But this doesn't negate any other virtues that the opposing side may and does embody. Bhishma is one of these virtuous enemies. And because of the gift of being able to choose the time of his own death even after he is wounded, he is actually wounded in the hostilities in the war, and he is dealt a fatal blow. But he lingers for a long time, several months actually, until he reaches an auspicious time to die. He also gives a very long speech, containing, of course, many pearls of wisdom regarding virtue and religion and many other items of legitimate concern to the society in which he lived, or rather from which he arose, because, of course, this is an epic, not a history. And before dying, he gives his blessing to Arjuna, who is one of the people involved in killing him. I tend to associate him very much with Nestor in the Homeric poems, in that he does tend to give long speeches. He's the old guy who gives long speeches laced with wisdom and the knowledge of days gone by. And there are many other character types and character configurations that are actually common between these two works and across other Indo-European epics. So we are very much here looking at the tip of a very deep iceberg. For now, though, let's move on to the next generation and talk about the parents of the principal antagonists in the narrative. That is, let's talk about the sons of Victor-Traviria. He has 3 sons all told, 2 of which are particularly important to us. But on the other hand, he has no sons at all. Victor-Traviria actually can't have children, or can't father children. So while he is treated as their father, their actual biological father in all 3 cases, both Dhritarashtra and Pandu, and also Vidura, a half-brother whose mother was a maid, is actually their ancestor Vyasa, Krishna Dvaipayana Vyasa, who is also the author of the poem, supposedly. I told you this was fun. And on the one hand, I also mentioned in the last talk that heroes with mixed parentage is actually not uncommon in Indo-European epic, and I'll pursue that one on the next slide, or rather the one after. I'd like to mention also that really all we're looking at here is surrogate parenthood, and this ought not to give anyone any difficulty. I think it's actually quite lovely here that the emphasis is not on the child of my loins, but the child to whom I act as father, the child that I raise. and that the child that one raises is no less a legitimate heir than the child of one's loins. So I think it's worth noting here that notions of quote-unquote legitimate parentage in this text and in this culture are not necessarily the same as these notions in some other ancient cultures with which students may be familiar. But now, to talk about the actual kids. I'll mention Vidura first because he's the least important of the three. He ends up fighting on the side of the Kauravas, although he again is one of those virtuous characters. I think it's actually maybe worth mentioning here, drawing another comparison with Homer. Homer is often praised for not drawing a clear good guys, bad guys dichotomy between the Greeks and the Trojans. He presents both sides as having certain virtues, and he presents both sides as having certain weaknesses. The Mahabharata proceeds largely the same way. So what we actually don't see here is any notion of they must die because they are unrighteous, and they are all given to sin. No, some of them are actually quite lovely people, and it's a genuine tragedy when they die. We're actually in a very intellectually and morally nuanced landscape here. This will really come out when we jump into the Gita itself. But as for the two more important sons of Viktravirya, the eldest, Dhritarashtra, whose mother Ambika is Viktravirya's first wife, is born blind. Pandu, the younger, whose mother is Ambalika, Viktravirya's second wife, is born sighted. Yes, this is a culture very much like Old Testament culture, in which men who can support them often have more than one wife. Though, as you will see in a moment, there is an interesting balance, or counterbalance rather, to that tendency or institution, at least in the narrative. Now, because Dhritarashtra is born blind, he is not considered fully capable of being king. One of the things a king has to be able to do is lead an army in battle, for instance. So the logic here really, although it's easy to simply dismiss as, quote, ableism, unquote, the logic is simply that if you are not physically capable of doing all of the things that the job demands of you, you shouldn't have the job. This is especially important where the job, being king, has you being responsible for the well-being of an entire kingdom. We might also remember, for instance, that in this mythology, eyes, sight, are particularly resonant. Think of, for example, Shiva's third eye. Notions of being able to see are not merely notions of having receptors for light. In myth, eyes have strong poetic resonance. And when we judge myth by the standards of our day-to-day conduct, we almost certainly almost always miss something. So as Dhritarashtra is unable to do the job physically, and perhaps not just physically, because physical blindness in mythological narrative can also indicate other kinds of blindness, the heir of Viktravirya becomes Pandu, and Pandu does become king. Now, and it's been a while since I've read the entire text, while Dhritarashtra does express some disappointment, I don't think he actually reacts viciously himself. There are many ways in which, and I can't get into the details here because we're not talking about the Mahabharata itself, but there are many ways in which I actually quite like Dhritarashtra. He also is not simply a vicious character and does actually have many virtues to commend him. And on his own initiative, he does not contest Pandu's kingship. So the real hard feelings, as we'll see in a moment, come not from Dhritarashtra himself, but from his sons and from one son in particular. So where he fails is not in behaving viciously on his own account, but rather in failing to control his sons, that is, basically in being weak. Though his sons, as you'll see, are quite a handful. And when I say handful, I think I might be understating a bit. Dhritarashtra and his wife Gandhavi have 100 sons, all of whom are hatched from a clutch of 100 eggs, and are considered to be more or less demonic in nature, or destructive in nature, if you wish. Their leader, and I believe the first hatched, is Duryodhana, who is described in the text as being a partial incarnation of Kali. And I'll return to that notion of partial and complete incarnations of various gods shortly. Now, you remember Kali from the previous part of this introduction, the goddess associated with both time and death. So you know wherever she shows up, things are going to be fun. Duryodhana really wants to be king, and it's largely Duryodhana's machinations that lead to the hostilities of the Kurukshetra war, at the beginning of which the Bhagavad Gita is set. So, as I said, Dhritarashtra's principal flaw, I think, is not in coveting or desiring things for himself, but in being unable to control his sons, and particularly his dominant son. He is effectively led by Duryodhana, and there is this configuration, kind of a joint sovereignty configuration between a weak father who himself is not necessarily bad, and a son led or dominated by his own desires. This shows up in other interesting ways, I think, in other Indo-European texts. It is, I think, a common motif, and a very old motif. I actually think I may see an echo of this in Priam and Paris at Troy, though of course Hector complicates things. Now, another way to read this is that the 100 sons, the chaotic mass of all of these children and all of these boys, represents an ungoverned and ungovernable body of desire that Dhritarashtra is unable to bring under control. I have encountered this reading of that configuration as well, and I think it's pretty solid. And as I mentioned in a previous talk, I tend to prefer both and approaches rather than either or approaches where different readings of texts are concerned. And in parentheses, Priam also has many sons, at least 50, I think. And it may be worth remembering that Helen of Troy, along with her 3 brothers, is also hatched from a clutch of eggs, and that she, either actively or passively, and honestly the scholarship is out on this one, lies at the root of the Trojan War. There are actually a number of interesting parallels between the Kurukshetra War and the Trojan War, and I think I might have more to say about that in a moment, because the Trojan War is an event that resonates deeply in Western culture. And this, I think, may give an anchor point to any students who happen to have encountered any of the narratives revolving around the Trojan War in approaching the Bhagavad Gita and its overall narrative context. These both are devastatingly destructive wars that mushroom out of control and that at root have in some way, as a cause, an ethical violation. But as this is also not a class on Homer, I'm going to just move on to the Pandavas now. Now, I'm going to go out on a limb and guess that when I said the Kauravas were 100 demon children hatched from 100 eggs laid simultaneously by Dhritarashtra's wife Gandavi, you thought that was the strangest thing I was going to say today. You're going to love this, because now it's time to talk about how the Pandavas came to be the way they are, and what the backstory is behind that. And to start, it all goes back to this time when Pandu the king was hunting in the woods. Specifically, he was hunting deer, and in a lapse of judgment, or perhaps at least taste, he shot a stag, a male deer, when it was not only in the middle of having sex with a doe, but right at the point of culmination. The deer didn't die immediately, but it was fatally wounded, and as it fell to the ground, it resumed its actual form, which was the form of a rishi, a holy man, who had simply changed forms. This is a worldview in which forms change. This shouldn't take anybody by surprise, I suppose, because this is also a worldview that does reincarnation. It doesn't posit that we are born in and as a particular thing, and that that thing is necessarily always stable. But the rishi was miffed at Pandu, as you can imagine, and I'm not going to give you his exact words. This takes place in Book 1 of the Mahabharata, but as Pandu approaches him, he kind of looks up at him and says something to the effect of, "Dude, couldn't you wait?" And to exact a little bit of revenge, or perhaps we might call it justice, he curses Pandu. And the specific curse he places on Pandu is, the next time you have sex,
you will die.
Now, this is obviously disappointing and inconvenient, but more importantly, it poses a bit of a political problem. Because, of course, one of the jobs of any king in a system where kingship is inherited is to produce an heir, in the absence of which nasty little kerfuffles such as civil wars tend to happen. So, in terms of fulfilling his royal responsibilities in that department, Pandu finds himself in a bit of a pickle. Now, obviously, there's a solution ready to hand in Pandu's own parentage, as his own dad couldn't father children. So, Vyasa, who incidentally was a Brahmin, stood in for that particular service. So, Pandu brings the subject up with Kunti, his first wife. And I'm not exactly sure what response he was expecting. Kunti is a very strong character. But probably he was not expecting her to actually come back with a counter-suggestion, and namely this was, in response to her own good actions some time back, she was actually given the boon of being able to conceive a son by the god of her choice whenever she wanted. So in response to her husband's suggestion that she have sex with a Brahmin, she says something along the lines of, "Honey, I think I have a better idea." And her idea specifically is that she have sex with Dharma, the god of Dharma. Or if you prefer, the personification of Dharma itself. Pandu is on board with this, and Kunti and Dharma spend a little quality time together, sometime after which Pandu's heir, Yudhishthira, is born. But of course, anyone who knows anything about royal families and successions knows that you never want to have just one son. But Kunti's arrangement is that whatever god she summons or trysts with will be with her only once. So if you want to have a second son, you need to spend some quality time with a second god. The second god in this case is Vayu, the god of the wind, also associated with strength. And the product of this union is Bhima. And at this point, things are just going so well, I guess, that she decides she's going to try this one more time, and never being one to aim low, she has a lovely evening with Indra, the god of the sky and rain, and as I mentioned before, sort of a champion among the gods. The product of this union is Arjuna, whom, if you've started reading the Bhagavad Gita by now, you have already met. But wait, there's more. Because Pandu doesn't have just one wife, he has two. And wife number 2, Madri, who knows exactly what's going on, is a little bit jealous. I mean, obviously, her husband's no good to her, in a purely physical sense, and yet she can't help but notice Kunti's carryings on. So she decides she's going to take matter into her own hands, and of course being rather polite and understanding that she is a second wife and needs to remain on the good terms of the first wife, she approaches Kunti with her problem. I find it interesting that Kunti is the first person she approaches. I find it interesting as well that these human divine trysts are done at the human woman's initiative, not only with her consent, her informed consent, but with her initiative. There is nothing whispering in their ears saying, "You will bear the children of the divine." No, not here. Here, they are the ones who make the decision. They are not in any way passive receptacles. And to get to the very non-passive Madri, she basically approaches Kunti and says something to the effect of, and excuse me while I paraphrase, "Hey, what's a girl gotta do to get on some of the god action here? I mean, we're both queens, and there's been a bit of a dry spell lately, and you're the only one who seems to be getting any." To which Kunti is not unsympathetic, but also being aware of her own priority or precedence as the first wife, she decides that it's okay for Madri to have relations with a god, but only to do so once. Madri agrees to this one-time only limit, but being Madri and nobody's dummy, she finds a bit of a loophole. Remember last lecture when I was talking to you about the Hindu gods and I mentioned A couple of gods called the Ashvins, the twins, who were particularly associated with beauty? Well, yeah, Madri remembers them too. And so, with something like Kunti's consent, Pandu's second wife Madri has a threesome with the twins. The results of which encounter are her own twin sons, Nakula and Sahadeva. Now, as the brothers grow up, they are all very close and extremely loyal to one another. And it is also worth mentioning something about their parentage and their functions within the text, so I'll take a couple of minutes to do that and then move on. You may remember in the last talk that I mentioned 3 functions that were generally present in Indo-European mythology and also social structure. And while the Pandavas are, of course, Kshatriyas, second function characters, the respective gods who father these 5 actually have associations with the 3 functions themselves. Dharma is a first function figure. The first function, you'll recall, is the priestly function. Bhima and Arjuna, warriors both, are second function figures. But they are not the same kind of second function figure. Bhima, the elder of the two, is big and strong and very simple and straightforward. There is something in him that is perhaps a little primitive, whereas Arjuna is the supremely skilled warrior. He is good at many, many weapons. The dynamic between these two, and quite frankly, I've always loved Bhima, strikes me as being very similar to the dynamic between, if we want to go back to Homer, Ajax and Achilles. Ajax, the giant who strides onto the field with a full body-length shield, a marker of a more primitive type of armament, and Achilles, the most skilled of all warriors in the world of Greek mythology. So here again, we're looking, I think, at different reflexes of a much earlier and much deeper mythological narrative pattern. As for the sons of Madri, the sons of the Ashvins, this is a third function association. Beauty particularly is associated with the third function more than the other 2. So what that means is in the 5 Pandavas, the whole ideological structure of Indo-European social structure and really religious and mythic thought is effectively present. So they embody, in some sense, the active principles of really the entire world from that particular mythic point of view. At least that's one possible way of looking at it. Now, to add to this, they're also born in the right order. The son of Dharma is the king. That is as it ought to be. So the functions are actually properly ordered in the order in which the brothers are born. To push this a little farther, and I hope I'm not pushing it too far, what this suggests is that the 5 of them together embody proper order, the proper order of the world, particularly the world ordered literally under Dharma. Now, I also mentioned back when we were discussing Duryodhana and the notion that he is a partial incarnation of Kali, that I would get back to that question as well. Each of these brothers is considered to be a partial incarnation of the god who is his father. So it is as though effectively there is a piece of Dharma in the narrative. There is a piece of Vayu, a piece of Indra, pieces each of the Ashvins. And these little god bits are acting in the human world. Now there's a difference between a partial and a full incarnation. A full incarnation of a god is called an avatar. That's where we get the word. Yudhisthira and his brothers are not avatars of their respective fathers. An avatar is understood to be effectively both fully human and fully divine. It is a complete incarnation of the divine in human form. That is definitionally what it is. Or at least in living form, I believe Vishnu incarnated at least once as an animal. But the human-animal boundary in Hindu thought isn't quite the same as what it is in Abrahamic thought. Now, as I mentioned, I think in the last class, the god Vishnu has had several avatars by this point. Or maybe I didn't mention that. I should have. This is, as I said, a Vaishnavite text, so we will be dealing a lot with Vishnu and one of his avatars. Krishna, whom you've met by now because you've started reading the text, is an avatar of Vishnu. That is, he is a full incarnation of the divine. Specifically, he is the 9th incarnation of Vishnu. So in that sense, he stands in this mythology in pretty much precisely the same position that the Jesus figure stands in Christian mythology. Setting aside special pleading that might be mounted on either side of that, functionally, both figures do exactly the same thing. They are full incarnations of the divine. Now, just to complete the picture of the family, there are a couple of more characters I want to say a little bit about. I won't take too long on them, but I think they're worth mentioning. The first, Karna, does come up, at least by being mentioned in Book 1 or Discourse 1 of the Gita. And the second, Draupadi, is just a fascinating character from a mythological point of view. Now, for Karna, I should say something more about Kunti, because she didn't just have relations with Dharma, Vayu, and Indra. She actually got together with Surya, I believe, first, perhaps as an empirical test to see whether this theory would actually pan out. And the product of that union with Surya was Karna. Now, Surya, you may recall, is the god of the sun. And if you've ever wondered what might be the product of a union of a human with the god of the sun, one possibility that might occur to you is that a baby will be born wearing a full suit of solid gold armor. Gold, of course, being the element associated with the sun for pretty obvious reasons. And don't worry that in reality, gold is actually a very soft metal. The standards and conventions of literary realism didn't really enter the picture until the early modern period, at least in the West, and the invention of the novel. Now, Karna is actually a great warrior, but because he is actually not in the line of succession, he wasn't authorized, his conception wasn't authorized by Pandu, he is kind of shut out of the whole inheritance picture. He is an outsider among his brothers. For this reason, largely, he ends up, when the war breaks out, siding with the Kauravas. He, like Duryodhana actually, feels basically that he's been cheated. Now, as for Draupadi, she is an absolute delight. She is the wife not of one of the Pandavas, but of all 5. So a really nice inversion of the patriarchal institution of polygamy. Her father is King Draupada, an ally of the Pandavas, and in the narrative she takes a very active role, particularly in terms of giving counsel and venturing her opinions and often explicit disagreements and anger at bad decisions that her husbands may happen to make. Now, the device, literary, mythological, what have you, that actually ends up having her become the wife of all 5 Pandavas is maybe worth mentioning. As I said before, the brothers are very close. Now, as a bit of backstory, once upon a time, King Draupada staged a sort of a tournament. This, as you can imagine, drew all kinds of people from miles and miles around, both competitors and audience. When Arjuna got wind of the competition, he decided he wanted to take part, and he promised his brothers, because of course they were all so close, that whatever he won, he would share equally among the 5 of them. Arjuna, of course, being the greatest warrior in the world, wins the tournament, and it turns out that the prize is the hand of the princess. That's a very common folktale and mythological motif with a really, really long lineage. And because a promise made must be kept, Draupadi becomes the wife of all 5. Now, I should say something about this motif as well, because it's not merely a patriarchal handing down of a princess as basically a game piece or a marker in a transaction. Although, of course, it can often look that way, and in real politics often does function that way. There are also figures in many Indo-European mythologies and many non-Indo-European mythologies that we might call sovereignty goddesses. And in that sense, the union of the king with the sovereignty goddess or her representative on earth is an expression of his proper kingship. That is, it's also an expression of the proper relationship with not just the political order, but the land itself. This is also something that shows up in some of the very early Inanna narratives, so therefore Ishtar narratives in that whole arc there. I mentioned that a little bit at least during our discussion of biblical mythology and its backgrounds in Mesopotamia. So as far as the Pandavas are concerned, being the dharmically proper embodiments of the political and social order, or representatives or rulers of the social order, with, as I said, Yudhisthira, the son of Dharma, acting as king, it makes sense mythologically that they would jointly be wed to this embodiment of sovereignty, which, as I said, in many mythologies is represented as some facet, I guess you could call it, of the divine feminine, though often secularized to a simple princess in folktale and other types of narrative. And I think, narratively, mythically, poetically, what have you, this is some of the work that the figure of Draupadi is doing. She is kind of the embodiment of the legitimacy of the order for which the Pandavas stand. But as I said, I guess a very long time ago now, the Bhagavad Gita is set at the beginning of hostilities in a major war. So now we should talk a little bit about the war. You already know the background. Duryodhana and his brothers are feeling left out, feeling that they have been treated unjustly because their father Dhritarashtra, the elder son of the former king, can't inherit because of his physical incapacity, which means they, specifically Duryodhana, can't inherit. There is a long backstory of hostility between the cousins, including numerous murder attempts, such as trapping them in a burning palace, from which Bhima rescues them all by carrying the entire family out on his shoulders after smashing through the wall. And this is just a single example of the kind of adventures and kind of narratives that are involved in this wonderful epic. But in terms of the immediate backstory for our purposes, it goes something like this. Yudhisthira has a weakness. He is incapable of turning down a challenge where gambling is concerned. Duryodhana and his allies know this about him, and so one day, an ally of Duryodhana, who is a skilled and dishonest gambler, challenges Yudhisthira to a game of dice, in cahoots, of course, with Duryodhana. The game, of course, is rigged, and Yudhisthira begins to lose possession after possession after possession. But because he keeps being challenged again and is incapable of saying no, the stakes keep getting higher and higher until eventually the kingdom itself is put at stake, and he loses. The conditions of his defeat are basically that for 12 years, the brothers have to forego all public engagements. They have to just retreat to a dwelling in the forest and leave the kingdom to Dhritarashtra and his sons. There's an additional condition that if they are recognized by anyone during those 12 years, they must dwell for yet another 12 years in the forest. And this, in fact, happens. So the brothers are in exile for 24 years, during which the kingdom is being run effectively by Duryodhana, with Dhritarashtra as a figurehead. It does, however, eventually come around to time for the Kauravas to return the kingdom to its proper rulers. In short, they don't want to. Sides are drawn up, very much as in the Trojan War, with which, as I said, this narrative has much in common. And the sides include, effectively, representatives or members or armies from every element of society, every element, rather, of the political world, the political order, of which the civilization at that time was aware. So basically, this is a world war. In a sense, the Trojan War also is a world war in that regard. All elements of the political order are pitted against each other on one side or another. And what is at stake in this instance is the kingship of what is understood to be the world. But of course, this isn't merely kingship in the political sense, because this is a question, quite literally, of whether the world will be ruled by dharma or not. And the world ought always be ruled by dharma, because dharma is definitionally the proper order of things. So in that sense, this isn't even about Yudhisthira, the individual, getting to be the king of the world. That, in fact, is quite irrelevant. what is at stake is the proper moral order of the entire human realm. And despite there being virtuous characters on both sides, the proper moral order of the entire human realm is always a question of dharma. So now I think I'd like to begin to wrap up a few matters that I've brought up over the last couple of talks. The structure of the Bhagavad Gita roughly reflects the structure of the Mahabharata. Just as the Mahabharata is broken up into 18 books, the Gita is broken up into 18 discourses. The first 6 books of the Mahabharata deal with the build-up and background to the Kurukshetra war. The middle 6 books deal with the war itself. And the last 6 books deal with basically the consequences and fallout. The structure of the Gita is actually very similar. The whole thing is a conversation between Krishna and Arjuna. The middle 6 books constitute a revelation of the divine. The first 6 books are the build-up to that revelation through process of conversation and questioning. And the last 6 books are basically the consequences of that revelation of the divine in terms of what this looks like in an individual human life. So in that sense, the epic in miniature is in a way played out in conversation and in a way that is applicable to an individual human life, which I think is why this particular text has resonated with such a wide range of people historically and across many different cultures. I've also mentioned numerous parallels with, for example, the Trojan War and other Indo-European narrative elements, so I think I'd like to wrap that up here as well. The Greek poet Hesiod, who is a contemporary of Homer, and equally likely or unlikely to have been actually a real person, posits 4 ages of the world. He classifies these ages by metals, so there is a golden age, a silver age, a bronze age, and an iron age. He also describes something called the heroic age, which I think I may have mentioned before. The heroic age was an age in which demigods had their heyday, and this age lasted for only 4 generations. It was an intermediary sort of semi-age or interlude between the Bronze Age and the Iron Age, and stretched, according to Hesiod, between, for example, the wars focusing around the city of Thebes in the first generation to the Trojan War in the last generation. So the Trojan War, the Homeric epics, mark quite literally the end of the heroic age in Greek thought. What follows is the Iron Age, the age in which we currently live. Now, there's a similar structure in the Mahabharata. There are also 4 ages posited there, the Satya, Treta, Dwapara, and Kali ages. The Kurukshetra war is positioned between the Dwapara and Kali ages. That is, as in Greek thought, we are now living in the Iron Age. In Hindu thought, or the thought of the Mahabharata at least, we are now living in the age of Kali, and the Kurukshetra war tells of the ushering in of that age. That is, even in the structure of time in 4 ages, it looks like both Greek and Sanskrit sources are working with and drawing on a much older, probably Proto-Indo-European understanding of how the cosmos works. And I like to think of both of these bodies of narrative in that way, and therefore through this understanding to, I think, approach an underlying unity of many of the myths and much of the thought of what outwardly may look like disparate and very distant or different worldviews, mythologies, outlooks, what have you. And for the record, you can also, I think, see echoes of this archetypal conflict, I guess, in the wars between the gods in both Norse and Celtic mythologies, something we just simply don't have time to dip into right now, but that I wanted to just toss out as a matter of interest in case anyone felt like looking into that. Now, though, finally, I think we're actually ready to get into the details of the narrative setting for the Gita itself. So the scene is this. The armies are drawn up on both sides. They're facing each other, knowing that what follows will be absolutely devastating no matter how it turns out. And Krishna, who thus far has simply appeared to be an allied king with strong ties to both sides, has given the respective armies the choice because he doesn't want to play favorites. He's offered one side his army and the other side himself. The Kauravas have chosen to have his army on their side, and the Pandavas have chosen to have Krishna himself on their side. Krishna in this is now functioning as Arjuna's charioteer. This is an epic about chariot warriors, very much as well as the Iliad, for instance, or the Iris Toynbee Bahúlinga. This is another Indo-European motif, largely attributable, I think, to the fact that it was the chariots, or seemed to have been their developments in chariot technology, specifically spoked wheels, that allowed them to advance, that gave them a tactical advantage on the field against the peoples into whose lands they were encroaching in the early stages of their diaspora. Spoked wheels are both lighter and stronger than wheels made from slats of wood, and sometimes a little difference in technology like that can have effects way beyond the proportions that one might expect just looking at the thing itself. But onward. In these epics, in these narratives, there is a special relationship between the warrior and the charioteer, and the charioteer or chariot configuration itself as demonstrating perhaps the deployment of force through both guidance and skill and intellect. So this unit, the chariot, contains both the warrior and the person who steers, the person who guides. And it is always in the warrior's best interest to listen to his charioteer, because the charioteer is literally the one who knows how to make things go. So that poetic resonance of warrior and charioteer, the one who deploys the force and the one who guides the force, is a very important one to bear in mind. So, just on the point of hostilities breaking out, Arjuna asks Krishna, his charioteer, to take him out to the middle of the field so he can survey the situation. The Bhagavad Gita is their conversation. And this at long last brings us to the end of the introduction to the Bhagavad Gita, what for many of you may well have been a monstrously long introduction. I hope now you all have a better sense of what it is you're actually reading. As I mentioned in the previous talk, this is, I believe, the most difficult and most complex text that we'll be looking at this year, and the one for which I have found my students require the greatest amount of situating. I will do one other, hopefully not too terribly long, audio-only talk this week, and all of the material I post next week will be just digging into the text, and I don't know yet whether there will be slides involved or whether it too will be audio-only. My approach to walking through the text is usually fairly conversational. I've only ever done it live before. So if I take that approach, I think the most appropriate format in terms of me actually getting stuff recorded might actually be the audio-only format. In any case, you should be well into your reading now. Hopefully this week you will have read to the end of Discourse 6, and the following week, Discourses 7 through 11, and then 18. I hope you've found these introductions useful and interesting. And I do very much look forward to seeing what you think of this really fascinating work. For the time being, though, thank you for listening. Bye for now.